Welcome everybody, welcome to this special edition of Truth Warrior. I'm your host David Whitehead, and I'm doing this interview on behalf of Modern Knowledge, and our website is modernknowledge.ca. And I'm here today with author Ralph Ellis. And Ralph, we've done some work with you before. We've interviewed you as a part of our Modern Knowledge series last year, which got a fantastic response, not only from the audience, but also from the other researchers that were presenting. They were very fascinated. We were kind of referencing a lot of your previous work on the pyramids of Egypt, the movement of the Hyksos, and getting into the Old Testament a little bit. And I'm very excited to do this follow-up interview with you and let people know about the work that you've been diligently doing. You've been working on a new book, and I understand it's close to completion. You've been working hard on it. So welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking this time with me again. And maybe just kind of fill people in on what you've been working on, what the book is about, and then we'll get in there and start asking some detailed questions for you today.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks for having me back again. It's always good to be back on the show again. I always get a good response when I do these. You can see it in the in the web figures and so on will go up considerably when I do these shows. So it's very nice to be back with you again. Yes, I've been busy, very busy. I'm doing a new book on Arthurian legend. And actually, I don't call it that. I call it Arthurian history because it's not legend. It's real history. And it's proving very interesting because it's very, very close to what I've been doing before. Anyone who's read my book before last, which was called King Jesus, will have seen a chapter. I just did a single chapter on Arthurian legend, where I said there were lots of similarities between the work I'd been doing on Jesus and Josephus and Arthurian history. And so I did this short chapter and said, look, there are many similarities here. And then I thought about it later, and it just looked like there was enough material here to go back and do a book. And there was, and it's taken a lot of my time. It's been on the go now for about a year, so it's a long project, and that's working every day, 7 days a week. Because it's fairly intense. It's a big subject. I didn't really want to tackle it because I already knew what was in store. Just the Vulgate cycle, which is the main legend I'm working on, is 3,500 pages.
Oh my goodness.
And
you were worried about your book being too long.
Let alone all of the normal ones that people research. And this is the problem I found with this genre, having gone through it. I've read a lot of other people's works on Arthurian legend as well, just to get a basis of what people are saying. And so many people, they will go through the old history, so they'll go through Gildas and Bede and Nennius, and then perhaps Monmouth as well, and they'll say, right, that's it. I've researched Arthurian history, but that only represents 10% of the available manuscripts. So all of the Arthurian histories that people have read before are not really Arthurian history, because you can't declare that you know what it's about when you've only researched 10% of the subject. And I've never seen any Arthurian history so far, whether alternative researchers or whether they were serious historians. I've never seen anyone that's tackled the Vulgate cycle, which is this enormous great volume that came out in the early 13th century. And that's perhaps one of the most critical parts of Arthurian history, because that's the really interesting bit. And it's not the history that people imagine. This history from the 13th century is more to do with the Middle East and the first century than it is with standard Arthurian history. So most of these books open with Joseph of Arimathea in Judea, and that's the story. So a lot of this story has nothing to do with standard Arthurian legend at all. It's something completely different, and that's what I've been working on. and it's proved to be very interesting, very rewarding. There's a lot of different topics out there which people don't think or would not understand as being Arthurian legend. For instance, there's a big history about I'm just thinking his name, Pompey Magnus, the Roman consul he was. He was like a Roman emperor, but they didn't have emperors in those days. Anyway, he was a Roman consul. He was the guy that was fighting against Julius Caesar. And so there's this big section on Pompey in Gibraltar. That's part of Arthurian history. And there are many other of these strange interludes where something happens that's completely different to what we expect from Arthurian history. But they all are a part of the real Arthurian history, because you can't understand unless you understand all of these interludes. So you get all these strange little isms, like there's a lot on the Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail is connected with the Ark of the Covenant as well, so that's all part of it. There's a lot on the Gali priesthood from Judea again, from 1st century Judea. And it's very different to, as I say, to normal Arthurian history, so that Arthurian history, as people normally read it, represents 2 chapters in this book out of 14 chapters. So that's the difference.
So it's to add all the context, I guess, to really try to demonstrate the connections behind it, right?
Yeah, and it all connects in with what I've done before with the books on Edessa and Judea and everything else, and it even connects back with some of my work on the Old Testament as well. It's all very interlinked. So this Arthurian story came out of the Middle East, a lot of it. So this is why it arrived in the 12th century. So the first Arthurian history that we know about that has the proper King Arthur was Monmouth in about, we'll call it about 1220 AD. Before that, there is no King Arthur. So, you know, when you read Bede and Gildas and Nennius, there is no King Arthur in those original histories. King Arthur only arrives on the scene in the early 12th century. So, yeah, 1120s, not 1220s, 1120s. And the reason he arrived on the scene in that era is because that was the era of the First Crusade. So a lot of these stories came back from the Crusaders. So this was returning Knights Templar coming back to northern France. And they created what we now know as Arthurian history.
So there was sort of like the original story, and then they bring it back and they kind of re-script it. It almost reminds me of when we spoke about the New Testament and sort of the story of Jesus in a way, where it was re-scripted and camouflaged with all this mythology.
It's part and parcel of the same story, because a lot of the story is about Jesus and it's about Joseph of Arimathea. It's all part and parcel of the same story. And as you say, yes, they have repackaged it and amalgamated it with British history, 5th century history, and repackaged it as a new story. But most of it is not 5th century. It's actually 1st century material. And it's heretical, and that's probably why they did it, because a lot of what they're saying would be worthy of a slow roasting by the Catholic Church, because it was extremely heretical. So how can you transmit this story, which is heretical, mostly about 1st century Judea, without being persecuted by the Catholic Church? I mean, there are things like Joseph of Arimathea was plotting against Jesus. So he was the original Judas, was Joseph of Arimathea. Well, that goes completely against what it says in the Gospels. You know, Joseph of Arimathea is supposed to be the great hero person. And yet, within Arthurian history, he was plotting to try and arrest Jesus. Completely different story, very heretical story. So how can you put out this story in the 12th century and 13th century without being arrested? And I think this is what they've done. They've amalgamated all this history into one big new semi-mythical history about a 5th century or 6th century king. But a lot of it is not. It's allegorical. So they're actually talking about something else entirely. So it's this strange blend between 5th and 6th century and 1st century. And you've got to try and work out what they're talking about. You know, when people like Sir Galahad, who's obviously, you know, one of the main Arthurian knights, when he meets with Joseph of Arimathea, what is this situation? Is it really some sort of apparition of Joseph that they've come across? Or is this really the 1st century? You know, because essentially what it's saying is Sir Galahad was in the 1st century. Well, that's a completely different story entirely. And so you've got to try and separate out these two stories and see what they're actually talking about. So it's been a very interesting project to get to the bottom of this. And it's come out with some very, very new points, very heretical stories about 1st century Judea.
Is it widely accepted, Ralph, that like this idea, for me even, it's new to consider the Arthurian legend as something coming out of the Middle East, and telling a story that was there? You know, usually whether you watch the movies or you're reading the stories, what most people are familiar with is that we're talking about a knight here. He's got 12 knights, 12 knights on the round table, and it's kind of scripted in a totally different backdrop. This must be, this whole way of looking at it is different, or is there other scholars that would have brought these points up as well?
No, I don't think anyone else has before, because, as I say, a lot of this is allegory. So when we're talking about the 12 knights of the round table, we're actually talking about a zodiac. Right. So the round table is a zodiac, with the 12 knights being the 12 constellations.
Which is where most people, that's why they think it's the myth. It's just the mythicist position is, oh, it's a myth. They're just talking about that. So there is a myth involved, but you're talking about the original story.
The constellations are real. So this is a story about the central beliefs and religion from the 1st century. Right. And the primary religion that they had was astrological, astronomical. And so if you go to Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, just below Tiberias, there is a synagogue down there. It is actually 1st century, so a 1st century synagogue. And the floor of the synagogue has a zodiac. And this is the Hamat-Tevera zodiac, which is a Jewish zodiac. I would say probably a Nazarene zodiac. And it's processional. So it marks the precession of the equinox. And it also marks the date of the 1st century AD. So this was one of the central elements of this early religion. And so when they start talking about 12 disciples of the Last Supper table and 12 knights of the Round Table, a lot of that is talking about the zodiac, the processional zodiac, because this was a very auspicious time in the 1st century, because we changed from one great month to another. So each constellation lasts in the sky for about 2,000 years, and these are called the great months. And the great month of Aries, the sheep, lasted until about the turn of the 1st century, so 0 AD. And then we went into Pisces, of course, the great month of Pisces. And that's why Jesus was born as a lamb of God under Aries, but became a fisher of men. So he was then the first king of Pisces. And of course, within Arthurian history, all of the main kings within Arthurian history are called fisher kings.
Right, yeah.
Because they are the kings of Pisces. And so all the way through, you get these hints at looking at the zodiac rather than looking at real knights. That doesn't mean that the knights and kings did not exist. You have to have a real fisher king to be the king of Pisces. And that's just like his official title, he's the fisher king. But it's acknowledging the fact that this king was born in the era of Pisces, which is very useful because we then know, when he was born. And quite obviously, this was a first century story because that's when Aries turned into Pisces. But it did in Arthurian history as well. When Arthur was born, the symbol in the sky was said to be a dragon. But and this was a dragon with two rays that came out of it. That's what it describes in Monmouth, anyway, he describes. But in Aramaic, a dragon is a fish. That's the translation.
Yeah.
Dragon is a fish in Aramaic. So the fish with two rays is the symbol of Pisces, of course. If you look at the symbol of Pisces, it has two rays coming out of it. So the Arthurian comet that appeared in the sky was actually the constellation of Pisces, because the first kings of Arthurian history are called fisher kings. And so again, we come back to the zodiac, and again, we're coming back to the 1st century AD. And so this, as I say, is a very different story to standard Arthurian history. If you go back to standard Arthurian history that you will see on the television, you will see knights in shining armor on a huge horse with a lance and a shield. But that's not what you would have had anyway in the 5th century. If you were going to portray a 5th century or 6th century king, he would have been dressed in Roman armor. And so all of the portrayals are wrong anyway, even if you wanted to put King Arthur back into the 5th and 6th century.
Did you ever see that, as you're talking, it reminded me of one of the newer films. It's just called King Arthur, and it's got Clive Owen in it, and they reference a slightly different turn on the Arthurian legend where he's a Roman, like he's at least a Sarmatian knight that was hired by the Romans. I'm trying to remember exactly how they did it, but when you see him in that film, he's in Roman attire, and yes, all of his knights, they're not from Rome. They were slaves that were conscripted to fight for Rome to defend one of the walls against the Saxon invasion. So I just found it interesting that this movie
is much closer to what the original history was. So if you go back to Bede and Gildas, the original British side, 5th century side of the history, that's exactly what it would have been like. Okay. And that part of the history appears to be based upon the history of Constantine III.
Right, okay.
Was a British king who tried to become Emperor of Rome. So he invaded France and then went down to try and take over Rome. But it was a revolt that was unsuccessful. And that was in the early 5th century. So yes, he would have been, much as you explained there, he would have been in Roman attire with Roman armor, in charge of essentially a Roman army. He would have taken the army from Britain, which would have been a Roman army essentially, and then traveled down through Gaul down towards Rome. That is the analog that they are basing all of the other stories upon. And that's the connection we get between the two sides. So we have this history of this famous monarch who is something like Constantine III. And he's been melded and mixed with these stories coming out of the 1st century Judea. and it's all become one big conflated story.
And there's the mythical elements that are imposed on it. Like I've always found this to be very interesting, because when you read online, you get on the forums or you see the videos people are putting out on these subjects, whether it's about the story of Jesus or the story of King Arthur, there's usually sort of like the fundamentalist view where they look at the history as right out of, the biblical scriptures or right out of the, official canon of the story. And then there's the other side, which is just purely mythical. And they're like, no, the whole thing is 100% myth, and it's all astrological, or it's some other kind of myth. And it's interesting that what you're doing is you're sort of showing that it's both. It's got a mythical element, and it also has a historical element. And you've always been sort of demonstrating that throughout your work.
Yeah, totally. And it's done exactly the same again. We saw this in the previous works where, King Solomon and King David are missing from the historical record.
Yeah.
And so therefore you have those two choices. It's either complete mythology or we're sort of looking in the wrong place for this history. And my work showed that these are real kings, but yeah, we are looking in the wrong place, and their capital city was in Zoan rather than Zion. So it was in Tanis, it was in Egypt. And the same with the Jesus story as well. So again, the deists will look at the New Testament and say, this is a real Jesus, this is exactly what happened. But they can't show you anything within the historical record whatsoever.
Right, yeah.
So the minimalists will say, well, therefore it's complete fiction. And so you get this divide that you described there. And the middle position, which is very difficult to take, is that this is a real history. But in order to say that, you have to go and find the real history,
right, yeah,
which nobody has been able to do before. And especially with the Jesus story, there is no history whatsoever, because they're looking in the wrong region and they're looking at the wrong era. And that's the only way. I don't think we discussed too much about the Edessa story, did we, last time?
Not really. No, we just sort of scratched it, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. So perhaps we ought to have a look at this, because it all does tie in at the very end. Jesus is missing from the historical record. So, you can either say this is complete mythology, or you just believe the text. But if you believe the text, you've got no history to go on to back it up. So where is this guy in the historical record? And the problem is very much like the King Solomon story and the King David story, is that they are looking in the wrong location and the wrong era. So he's been deliberately misidentified because they didn't want you to know who he really was. And so the best way to divorce him from his real self is to change the era. Because if you look in the AD 30s for a Jesus guy, you'll never find him.
Right.
And so he remains mythical. He remains an icon that Josephus, because I believe a lot of this work was written by Josephus.
Josephus, yeah.
Josephus Flavius, yes, the great historian of the first century who fabricated this entire new story.
And really only referenced him as a Christ, right? And there was only a couple references that you can find, and they used the term Christ, I believe, and which is just a title, really.
Yeah, it just means king. Christ means king. Christ is the Messiah, the anointed king. But many of the kings were messiahs and Christs. So if you read the Vulgate Bible, which is the Latin Bible, and you read the story of Saul and King David, it calls them the Christ, because that's what it means. It means the king. So this guy was a real king. So if we take it literally, yes, he was a real royal king. He was born as the king of the Jews, and he died as the king of the Jews. So let's say he was the king of the Jews. Why not? So he was a real king, but that elevates him way above the status that they have given him. And again, this revised status is to divorce him from his real self, so you don't know who it is. So if you're looking around Judea for a carpenter, you're never going to find a guy. You've got to understand who this guy is before you can find him in the historical record. And the carpenter one is a great one. I don't know why people don't mention this, but it seems so obvious. In the New Testament, he's not called a carpenter, of course. He's called a tecton, which can loosely be described as a carpenter, but more often than not, it means an architect.
So we're talking, it almost reminds me of like a mason or a stonemason or
it was, because if you go to Greece, a tecton is a Freemason.
Right, yeah, okay.
So Jesus was a Freemason. That was his official title. He was a Freemason.
That would be a good title for a book, by the way. That'd probably...
It could be, yeah. I've written about this before, actually, so it's nothing new in my work. I wrote about this back in 98, I think it was.
Yeah, right.
A long time ago, 17 years ago. So, yeah, if you look at the raising of Lazarus in the New Testament, in the Gospel of John, it's a third-degree raising. So if you go for a third degree, I'm a Mason myself, I've been a Mason for many years. If you go to the third degree raising, it is exactly the same as the raising of Lazarus. And there are many pointers all the way through the gospel stories that this was a Masonic type sect. It was very much the same. They ran the same sort of social system. It was like a sort of semi-socialist, communist type system where everybody lived out of the same purse. So there was no private money and so on. It was a bit like living on a kibbutz. You know, if you go to a kibbutz in Israel, that's exactly the same system they ran there. It was very common in the first century. They had many interconnected sects that did all the same thing. So the Ebionites did the same, the Essenes did the same, the Bothians did the same, and the Church of Jesus, the Nazarene, did the same. So they were all of these sort of, and of course the Knights Templar, that's where the Knights Templar got it from. If you joined the Knights Templar, you did not have your own assets and money. Everything came out of the common purse. It was run on exactly the same system. In fact, actually, the Knights Templar, if you look at the constitution of the Essene and compare it with the Knights Templar, it's almost exactly the same.
Right.
So it's quite obvious that when they went down to Judea in the First Crusade, they obviously came across this Essene constitution, and they just borrowed it basically, and then that became the Knights Templar. So they were literally the followers of the Essene. Almost exactly. So yes, you have this first century king and Mason, and he wasn't born or he wasn't active in the AD 30s. And as I say, this is the main reason and method that they've managed to divorce this guy from his real self. He was actually active in the AD 60s. So, you know, when we come to the crucifixion story and it says that Jesus was tied up and put in prison with Barabbas, who had committed murder in the revolution. So he was alongside people who had committed murder in the revolution. What revolution was this? You know, if you look at the AD 30s in Judea, there was no revolution. So what's it talking about? Well, it's talking about the Jewish revolt, which was the late AD 60s. So we've jumped 40 years from AD 30 to AD 70 in the story. And that's how they've hidden Jesus. And the funny thing is, again, coming back to our Arthurian story, Arthurian history does exactly the same because it's part and parcel of the same story. So you have Joseph of Arimathea in Arthurian history. Now, he's the guy who took Jesus down from the cross, obviously, and this has to be the AD 30s because that's what the Gospels say, or At least that's what everyone thinks, they say. But Joseph of Arimathea was a colleague of Emperor Vespasian in the AD 70s. And this is a problem, because how does the author manage to bridge that gap, this chronological chasm, as I call it? So what he does in the Vulgate cycle is he makes Joseph go to sleep for 40 years. So he goes to sleep for 40 years, he wakes up and thinks that only 3 days have gone by. And now he can get his character from the AD 30s into the AD 70s, so he can meet with Emperor Vespasian. It's the same problem. So we have this 40-year chasm within the gospel history, and we also have the same 40-year chasm within Arthurian history as well. It's part and parcel of the same story and the same problem.
Anything symbolic about the fact that it's specifically 40 years?
It's not precisely 40 years. In Arthurian history, it says 42 years. I'm not quite sure why it says 42. It ends up in AD 72 instead of AD 70. I'm not quite sure why that is. But yeah, the number 40 was very symbolic. So they probably chose that because it is a symbolic span of time within all of the stories. So, you'll have 40 days and nights, Israelites were 40 years in the wilderness, all of this sort of business. It's symbolic of the Great Pyramid. I don't know, did we go through that last time?
Yeah, we touched on this, on the Great Pyramid.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because 40, 41, and 42, they seem to pop up a lot in these old movies. Like, I remember in Ben-Hur, his slave number was 41. I remember when he was on the galley ship. Yeah. And I just remember, I remember because I grew up on a lot of these old movies, the Charlton Heston, Cecil B. DeMille films and all that. And it always popped out at me. And then as I was reading your work and referencing some other researchers, I just noticed these numbers keep popping up. And that's why when you said 40-year spans, I'm like, what's up with this 40 number?
It's always there. It's a sign of initiation. If you know the number 40 is important, then you know the secrets of the Great Pyramid. That's what it's all about.
Right, okay.
The Great Pyramid is a 40 times multiple of pi,
Right.
And that's where the number 40 comes from. And so it's been used on numerous occasions within the Old and New Testament, which is why Jesus has the 40 days and nights in the wilderness and all the rest of them.
Right.
So yeah, they've managed to divorce this story from its real self by displacing it into the past by 40 years. So you're never going to find the Jesus character if you sit there looking in the AD 30s, because he doesn't exist there. It's a very effective ploy, because no one's ever found this guy in the historical record, because they've covered his tracks so well. And the other way they covered his tracks is by deleting his kingdom. So, jumping ahead a little bit, his kingdom was the kingdom of Edessa, which is over in northern Syria. That's why the last book was called Jesus, the King of Edessa. And so what Josephus has done is delete Edessa from history and delete the Edessan royalty from history. So here we have a guy, Josephus Flavius, who wrote an entire history of the first century Judea and Syria. Every single event is mentioned in his comprehensive works. But there is no Edessa, and there is no King Akbar, who was the king of Edessa in the early part of the first century. And there is no King Manu either, who was the next king. They've been completely deleted from his history. So why has he done this? It's the only kingdom that's been deleted from his history, completely missing, because he didn't want you to know who these people were. And it's just as well there were some other histories around, otherwise we wouldn't know anything about this. The reason we know about these kings is because some of their coins started turning up in the east, so we knew that there was this king called King Akbarus. But also the Armenian and Syrian historians were not subject to the same controls that were being dictated by Rome. So Josephus Flavius ended up as a puppet of the Romans, of course. He was working for the Romans. He was a Jewish traitor, effectively. He was a Jewish rebel who surrendered himself to the Romans and became the Roman propaganda minister, basically, working for the Romans against the Jewish rebels. Because he believed that you would never win a war against Rome, and so he joined the Romans. And so everything that Josephus wrote has a Roman slant to it, because he was writing propaganda as well as history for the Romans. And what Rome did not want you to know is anything about the people who fermented the Jewish revolt in the late AD 60s. I mean, this was a problem for Rome. You know, you got this big revolution in the eastern borders of the Roman Empire, and they wanted to crush this rebellion. And the best way to do it is by deleting all of those people from the new history that was being written. And the new history that was being written by Josephus Flavius. And so obviously Vespasian said to Josephus, right, delete all of these people completely from your history. And that's what he did. So there is no Edessa, it doesn't exist in the works of Josephus. And there is no King Akbarus, even though he was very influential in that era. These were the guys who saved Judea from famine in AD 47. His wife, Queen Helena, she made all of the furniture for the Temple of Jerusalem, including the golden menorah, a solid gold menorah, the big candlestick in the Temple of Jerusalem, which was so expensive that when the Romans sold it, because the Romans captured it in AD 70, of course, when the Romans sold it, they actually managed to build the Colosseum in Rome, was built on the money that they took from this king.
Really? That's interesting.
That's how much money they took from this king.
Wow. And how did this, just to kind of pause you for a sec here, Ralph, how did this kind of alternative information start leaking out? You said there was some coins that started popping up. Were there other manuscripts and other historians that were starting to document this? Or
there were, because as I was saying, Josephus was the propaganda minister for Rome.
Right.
But of course, there was a split. Of course, there was a split in the first century between Rome and Parthia. So Roman law stopped on the eastern borders of Syria, effectively, and the rest of the Mesopotamia was all Parthia. It was not under Roman control. And then we come into the centuries AD, and all of Mesopotamia became Christian, of course. Pretty much all the way down through modern Iraq, all of Jordan, into Iran was all Christian and Jewish, of course. There was no Islam. But this divide was still there. But now this was the divide between the Roman Christianity and there was the Roman Christianity, there was the Byzantine Christianity from Constantinople. But after the Council of Chalcedon, which was in the early 5th century, the Mesopotamian side, the Syriac church, became totally separated because they did not agree with the Council of Chalcedon, which set the creed to the Catholic Church as we know it was set at that council meeting. And the Syriac church did not agree with it. And so they were cut off completely from the Roman Catholic Church and also from the Byzantine Church as well. So the Armenian Church was completely separate. The Syriac and Armenian Church was completely separate to the church from Constantinople and from Rome. And these people in the Syriac Church the kings of Edessa were effectively their kings. They looked towards Parthia and towards Edessa for their kings. And so they amalgamated the history of Edessa into their history. So they actually claimed that these Edessan kings were Armenian kings. Because effectively they did. They ruled Armenia as well as Parthia and so on. And so they amalgamated them into their own history. And by doing so, they preserved the history of the Edessan kings. Otherwise, we wouldn't know anything about them. So we have these separate histories, and they were quite prolific over in Mesopotamia, in eastern Syria. So we have things like the Chronicle of Zukhnin, which nobody seems to know about, mainly because it's not been translated into English, which is a real pain. It's all in Latin. And the history of Moses of Corinne. Who are these historians? Well, these are Eastern Syriac historians who are not really a part of the Western history that we normally know. And so what I did was compare the two histories. And I don't know why nobody has done this before, because it seems such an obvious thing.
Right, yeah.
To compare, say, Moses of Corinne with Josephus, because they were writing about the same history, about the same events in Judea, so just link them together and see what happens. And suddenly you find that all of these gaps in Josephus' history are actually written about by Moses of Corinne or the Chronicle of Zukhnin or whatever. And so we have wonderful cases like the battle between King Aretas of Petra. This was the battle caused by the beheading of John the Baptist. Yeah, so this is the famous scene from the Gospels where John the Baptist is beheaded because he criticized the marriage of one of the Herods. I'm trying to think who it was. It was Herod Archelaus, I think. Anyway, one of the Herod kings, one of the sons of Herod the Great. He was criticizing his marriage because he was marrying the wife of one of the other tetrarchs within Judea. And so the marriage was illegal, effectively. That's what John the Baptist was complaining about. And so because of this criticism, John the Baptist got his head cut off. There followed, one of the problems was that the Herod king that was involved had to divorce his first wife. And his first wife was the daughter of Petra. And he was not very impressed. So he went to war with Herod. This would have been in about AD 33, something of that nature. And what it says in Josephus is that King Aretas and some fugitives from the province of Philip battled against Herod. So it calls them the fugitives from the principality of Philip, which is effectively northern Syria. If you go in, it says that this was the army of the Edessan king. This was the army of King Agbaras of Edessa. So what he has done is to delete this part of the history. So Josephus has given us the details of this, but refused to say who was involved in it. And of course, because it was the Edessan king that was involved. Same as with the famine relief in Judea. Josephus says that a king of Adiabene gave famine relief to Judea in AD 47. But if you go into the Armenian historians, they will say it was King Agbaras of Edessa gave the famine relief. And this ties in again with biblical history. So it's all part and parcel of one history, of course, because in Acts of the Apostles, the person who gives famine relief in Acts of the Apostles is called Abagus. Instead of Agbarus, they call him Abagus. They've swapped the consonants around. And they've done it deliberately because they have done it because they've changed his name into a locust. So by changing the two consonants in the center, his name becomes the King Locust instead of King Agbarus. And the reason they did that was because they didn't like this guy. You know, this is why they've deleted him from history. They didn't like this guy. And so they've changed him into a locust because in the Old Testament, the plagues of Egypt, the locusts came from the east and destroyed Egypt.
Oh, yeah, interesting.
So now what they've done is they've turned his name into a locust so that they're saying, because they came from the east, they came from Parthia.
Right.
So they're saying that they are locusts from the east who came to Judea and destroyed Judea. Because this king was the king who started the Jewish revolt. So again, this is not given in Josephus' history. He says that the guy who started the Jewish revolt was King Monobazus of Adiabene. But again, that's just a cover story because Monobazus just means the only king. And the only king in biblical terms is actually Jesus. He was called the only king. And Adiabene does not exist. Adiabene was actually Edessa. So the king who started the Jewish revolt was the king of Edessa, who was King Agbarus. Well, actually, it was his son, but there we go, because we move on one generation. So the central characters within this story are actually the Edessan monarchy. Actually, it goes even closer than that, because when they were talking about in Acts of the Apostles, they were talking about the famine relief going down to Judea. This is AD 47. And the famine relief was given by Agbarus, who they called Agabus. The people who took it, the famine relief, down to Judea were Saul and Barnabas. This is the biblical Saul. This is Saul Josephus. This is Josephus himself taking the famine relief money down to Judea from Antioch. And of course, in Acts of the Apostles, it says they came from Antioch. And of course, everyone looks at the map and says, right, well, Antioch is the big city. If you imagine the Mediterranean, if you go to the top right-hand corner of the Mediterranean, that is Antioch. It's called Antakya nowadays. It's in Turkey nowadays. But that's not what they were talking about at all. This famine relief came from Edessa. And it just so happens that Edessa was called Antioch. Sorry. Yes, it was called Antioch. So Edessa was called Antioch Edessa. And the other one was called Antioch Arons. So they've misidentified the city that this money came from. But this is interesting because the people, as I say, who took the famine relief money were Saul and Barnabas, the biblical Saul and Barnabas. Which means that they were actually going to Edessa, not to Antioch near the Mediterranean. They were going to Edessa.
Oh, okay.
Edessa is just across the Euphrates. It's not actually that far away. It's about 150 kilometers or something east of the other Antioch, just across the Euphrates in Mesopotamia. And that's where they came from. So the biblical story itself is not centered on Antioch in Syria. It's centered on Antioch, Edessa. So the whole story is an Edessan story. But you would never know that if you just read the Gospels and if you read Josephus, because it's all been deleted from history.
And if Josephus Flavius is essentially Saint Paul, right? Like, because
Yes,
if it's
Saint
Saul,
Paul.
and we're talking, he elevates to Saint Paul, and of course he's the one that supposedly crafted the New Testament, right? So you're kind of bringing in some of the culprits involved in sort of bringing the mythological layers and then leaving out the layers that they didn't want. Of course, like you said, the Romans didn't want him to write about it.
Yeah, everything was written by Josephus. I don't know how deeply we went into this last time, how Saul is connected to Josephus.
I think you actually left me with, you were going to tell me, but you were waiting until you had, I think it was probably this book you were working on, or you were in that zone. So we didn't really you left us with a little hint. So we just gave it away.
But it's actually something I wrote about back in '97, I think it was, in my first book.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, Jesus Last of the Pharaohs. It was, again, I do this quite often. It was one chapter in a book. And then everyone said, no, that's impossible. That's stupid. You can't say that. It's not going to, it doesn't exist. But I then turned that one chapter into a complete book, which became the book King Jesus.
King Jesus, yeah.
Which proved that it was actually true. So I actually said this back in '98, but then I didn't really fully prove it until we got to the book King Jesus. And yeah, it's a very simple proposition. Saul doesn't exist in the historical record. So again, like all of these characters, like, King David, King Solomon, Jesus, Saul does not exist in the historical record. But this is strange because Saul is the most influential person of the last 2,000 years. All of Christianity was crafted by Saul.
Right.
He was the guy who wrote all of the epistles. He probably wrote Luke as well. He probably wrote Acts. Because they all have his fingerprints all over them. And even normal, Orthodox theologians will acknowledge that Luke and Acts have a lot of Sauline material in them. So this guy was extremely influential in Christian history and Christian formation. And it basically says anyway within the New Testament that within Gospel history, it says that Saul created what I call simple Judaism. So you had the standard 3 or 4 Judaisms. You had the Sadducees, you had the Pharisees, you had the Nazarene, which was the Church of Jesus and James, of course. They were Nazarene. And then you had Saul, who was trying to preach to the Gentiles. So he became the apostle of the Gentiles, he called himself. But the Gentiles didn't want the full Mosaic law of Judaism. It was too complex for them, and they certainly didn't want to be circumcised. So Saul went to James. This is all in Acts, so this is all standard Christian history. Saul went to James, the brother of Jesus, and said, look, can I have a simplified form of Judaism for the Gentiles? Because they don't want all of your rules from Leviticus. And he said, yeah, that's okay, no problem. And he gave Saul 4 laws for the Gentiles, which, let's see if I can remember them. It was not to indulge in fornication, not to eat strangled animals, not to eat animals sacrificed to idols, and something else. Anyway, there were 4 laws, and that was it. So the whole of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, all of the laws, all of Mosaic laws, came down to 4 basic rules for Gentiles, which is why I call it simple Judaism, because it was extremely simplified. And so he gave these 4 rules for new simple Judaism to Saul, who then went off and preached as an apostle to the Gentiles. So he created this new form of Judaism, which I call simple Judaism, which eventually became Christianity. So the Christianity that people followed has nothing to do with the Church of Jesus at all. Jesus was a Nazarene. And anyone who's following Christianity is actually following the Church of Saul. So this guy was very important, and yet we've lost him from the historical record somehow. And so the only way you're going to find this guy, you're not going to find the name Saul, is by looking at similar events and similar characters within first century history. And there is a character who is extremely similar to the New Testament Saul. And one of the similarities I like is the shipwreck. So Saul goes off on a ship, a prison ship, because he was actually arrested. He was a prisoner. He goes off on a prison ship with a load of other prisoners going to Rome. And they go to Cyprus, or is it Crete? Anyway, either Cyprus or Crete. And then they set off again from Cyprus or Crete, and they get caught in a storm, and they are shipwrecked. And they eventually, after the shipwreck, they swim and land on Malta. And then they are taken from Malta to Naples to go and see Nero in Rome. Well, Josephus Flavius does exactly the same. Josephus Flavius was on that same ship, and he was shipwrecked as well, and ended up on Malta, and then was taken to Naples, and then goes off to see Nero in Rome. So either you've got to say, look, these two very, very similar characters were on this same shipwreck.
They're just buddies. They're hanging out. They do two guys, one show, right?
Yeah. You never see them together. You know, they're always. Yeah. You see them there, but you never see them together. They just have to be the same person. But they can't mention this, or rather, Josephus can't mention this, because his two personas are very, very different. So, okay, these were the same person now. Saul was Josephus. But after the Jewish revolt, this guy was working for the Romans. And as we said before, the Romans wanted to quell any revolts in the eastern borders of the Roman Empire. And so what they wanted to do was quell the revolutionary form of Judaism that was around in Judea and Syria at that time. So how do you quell a religion? Well, you can amend its history, which they did, and you can start a rival religion,
right,
which is Rome friendly. And that's exactly what they did. So they started what Vespasian said to Saul Josephus was, give me a simplified form of Judaism that is Rome friendly. And this is why when you read the Gospels, it says such wonderful things as render unto Caesar that belongs to Caesar.
Right, yeah.
Do you think he would really say that? He's a revolutionary Jew who was fighting the Romans. Do you think he'd really say that?
Yeah, right.
No, this is being put in there because this was created, this new form of simple Judaism was created by Saul Josephus. And he was working for the Romans. And the Romans said, right, this new religion has got to be Rome friendly. And the main tenets that it had to satisfy is they had to pay Roman taxes. You had to be able to act as a good Roman because Judaism was a pain in the backside in the Roman Empire because the Jews would not eat with Romans, they would not sleep with Romans, they would not bathe with Romans, they would not pray with Romans. And so what Saul Josephus created was a Roman Judaism where you could eat with other Romans and sleep and bathe with other Romans and look like other Romans. So you shaved your beard because most Romans were clean shaven. So you could be a part of this religion and be a good Roman at the same time. That's exactly what Vespasian wanted, and that's exactly what Saul Josephus created.
So it's clearly a political move to unite it, to, as you said, quell the revolution, which is exactly what they would have needed to do. And they would have been experts at doing this, because we are talking about the Roman Empire here. And this is obviously not the first time that they would have had to deal with something similar to this, but maybe because of how widespread it was, the other solutions weren't really working. So like you said, just craft a new friendly religion, unite everything together. And it's funny, and they get a character who is Jewish, but yet working for Rome to do it. It works perfectly.
Yes, absolutely. He was the perfect quiz. Well, mind you, this is what they did in many other places. They turned princes into good Romans, and then sent them back into their nations to go and lead their nations as a good Roman nation. That was fairly standard in the Roman Empire. They even did it with King Agbarus of Edessa. He did exactly the same. When he came into Syria from Parthia, because they were exiled from Syria to Parthia.
Kind of like what the U.S. tries to do today. They go in and they put the economic hitmen in there. And actually, typically, they're working on the Middle East right now. So it's almost like history might be sort of playing itself out again. But anyways.
It's this a tried and trusted technique of making people into good Romans or good Americans.
That's right.
You take them into America or Rome, and you show them the benefits of being friends with Rome or America. And, after 5 years or 10 years of being central to that society, they end up as being good Romans or good Americans. That's why they take princes from various regions and put them into American universities or British universities, so that they grow up within that system and become good Americans or good Britons. And Rome did exactly the same. So when King Agbarus came into Syria, they took him and sent him to Rome, effectively as a prisoner. But of course, he wasn't a prisoner in a prison cell. He would have been given a big mansion and servants and as many mistresses as he cared to desire. And the idea was that after 5 years, in fact, he was there for 7 years, I think he would be so much a part of the Roman system that he would be a good Roman. And this is what the Romans did, and they did it very effectively with all of the nations that they conquered in the empire. They were trying to do the same in first century Judea, but it hadn't quite worked in Judea because the Jews were very much a separate society that would not become good Romans. And after the Jewish revolt, Judea was destroyed, so there was no Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been completely destroyed. Most of Judea had been destroyed. There was something like it's claimed anyway, 1 million Jews were taken into slavery. So there was a blank canvas within Judea, and the guy in charge in AD 70 after the revolt was Josephus Flavius, Saul Josephus, and he was in charge. He was the Romans' head man in Judea who could sort the place out. So he could do whatever he liked. If he wanted to change something, he could do it. If he wanted to make a new religion, he could do it. He had the full backing of Rome to do whatever he wanted. And so at this point, everything changes in Judea. So even Judaism changes. So standard Judaism up until that point was still sacrificing animals at the temple. Suddenly, after the Jewish revolt, the Jews forget about that entirely. If you go to a synagogue today, you don't see animals queuing up out the front to be slaughtered.
Right.
when did that change? Why did that change? It changed because after the Jewish revolt, the guy who was in charge was actually Saul Josephus, and he didn't like animals. Well, same as Jesus. Jesus, if you remember, drove all the animals out of the temple. Said, stop making my temple into a charnel house, basically. And so all of that was changed by Saul Josephus after the Jewish revolt. And so he changed Judaism, and he changed Judaism by making this new simple Judaism, which we call Christianity. So we have found Saul within the historical record. He was Josephus Flavius. And that has a big knock-on effect. The reason why nobody will admit to this, the Jews won't admit to it, and the Christians won't admit to it, is because it changes the story quite dramatically.
For both groups, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for both groups. And so the Jews won't talk about it either. I mean, they do within the Talmud, they talk about it quite a lot, but they will not talk about it openly. So it's all within ciphers and riddles and so on, so you don't actually know what they're talking about. But they talk about it as well. The main thing it changes is the date. Because this can't really be an AD 30 story, because Saul Josephus was only born in AD 37. This has to be an AD 60s story, an AD 70s story. And that is the main change. So all of the gospel history has to be shifted into AD 70 to fit the life of Saul Josephus. And this was one of the big criticisms I had of this theory. They said it can't be that because Saul has to be older. But why does he have to be older? He doesn't have to be that old. He went on his first tour of the Mediterranean. They went on these evangelical missions across the Mediterranean. His first trip across the Mediterranean was in AD 52. Well, in AD 52, Josephus would have been 15 years old. So, of course, he could have gone on that evangelical journey. He would have been a man by that stage, because, of course, his bar mitzvah would have been at age 14. So he would have been a man going on an evangelical mission, the same as, Mormons do today. They send off the youngsters. They don't send off old guys on these tours. They send off the youngsters, and they did exactly the same. So he would have gone off on the first mission across the Mediterranean when he was 14, 15 years old. And so all of this history works, but you have to move the gospel stories into the AD 60s, otherwise it doesn't fit. So that was the main change that they were doing, the reason why they were covering up who Saul was. And the other reason they were covering up who he was because Josephus wasn't really the type of person you would want as the main creator of Christianity, the main disciple of Jesus, as it were. Because this guy was a Jewish traitor working for the Romans. His history was just not compatible with what the Christian story wanted. So they had to change him. And the other reason why they had to change him as well was because Josephus Flavius became the army commander in charge of Galilee. This was in the late AD 60s. The main person he was contending with and fighting against in Galilee was Jesus of Gamala, who was this king from Edessa.
Edessa, right.
In Edessa, he was called Isis. And obviously the Judaic equivalent of that was Jesus. It's the same name. So you have this guy, Saul Josephus, in Judea in the first century fighting against a guy called Jesus. And of course, this is exactly what it says in Acts of the Apostles, where it says, Jesus says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It was the same story, the same battle. But nobody could admit to that. And so he had to have two personas. He had to have the biblical persona to write the Gospels. And he had to have the secular persona to write the secular history of Judea, Jewish war and his life. And so, this is our Saul Josephus. He was the guy who created this story for the Romans. More interesting than that, in some respects, is he created Arthurian history as well.
Okay, so this is where we come to the story where we're bringing it all back up together.
Circle.
Yeah.
We're coming back full circle because, as we said at the start of this talk, most of Arthurian history from the Vulgate cycle is about Joseph of Arimathea. That's the main character in these stories. But who is Joseph of Arimathea? Again, he's one of these guys who's missing from the historical record. He's not there. How do we lose all of these guys? They all go missing completely. Because nobody wanted to admit who he was. So who was Joseph of Arimathea? He was the guy who took Jesus down from the cross. And he comes out of nowhere in the middle of this history. You have this big gospel history, and suddenly this guy just strolls out in the last scene and pulls Jesus down from the cross.
And it's kind of written as if you're supposed to know who he is, eh? Like it's
precisely. Well, of course they would have done, but of course only if you know who he is. So who was he? Well, if you look at Saul Josephus in his life, which is one of his latest works that he wrote, he says that after the Jewish revolt, he was coming back from Tekoa. He was an army commander, remember. He was working for the Romans as an army commander working for Rome. And he was coming back from Tekoa, which is Herodium, just south of Jerusalem, after the Jewish revolt. And he came across the three leaders of the Jewish revolt who were being crucified. And of course, the leader of the Jewish revolt was called Esus. We know that from Josephus' work himself. Esus of Edessa. This was the Edessan king. So he comes across the three people being crucified in the Kidron Valley, just outside the city of Jerusalem. And he goes to the Roman commander, who is Titus at the time, and asks if he can take them down from the cross, because they were his previous colleagues and compatriots. So Titus says, yes, you can take them down from the cross. So he takes these three people down from the cross and gives them medical treatment. Two of them die, but one of them survives. Familiar story?
Right.
This was the gospel story. This was the crucifixion story of the three leaders of the revolt, which was what Jesus was, being taken down from the cross. And the guy who took them down from the cross was called Josephus. Josephus of Arimathea. So not only was Saul Josephus Flavius, he was also Josephus of Arimathea. So now he has three personas. And he has to have three personas because nobody could admit to Josephus Flavius taking Jesus down from the cross. That wouldn't work.
Right.
Because it has to be an AD 60s, AD 70s story. Josephus was only born in AD 37, so this, that can't be an AD 30s story. It has to be an AD 70s story. And it wouldn't really work if they said Saul took him down from the cross. Because remember, Saul was the enemy of the Church of Jesus. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me, etc. Right. It wouldn't really work if they had Saul taking Jesus down from the cross either. So he had to have three personas in the end. Oh, and it couldn't be Saul either, again, because it would be the wrong date again. Because even if you took the classical Saul, most people say that Saul was born in about AD 10 or AD 20. Well, it couldn't be Saul taking Jesus down from the cross in the AD 30s. The chronology doesn't work. So nobody could admit that it was Saul Josephus that took Jesus down from the cross. They had to have another persona. And that persona was Josephus of Arimathea. And that's why when you come to Arthurian history, you have Josephus of Arimathea being put in prison and going to sleep for 40 years and then waking up in AD 70 so he can meet with Vespasian. Mm. And that is also why you have Joseph of Arimathea being a colleague of Vespasian. Why is this guy who was the great savior of Jesus, the colleague of Vespasian? That he's working on the wrong side. He's not working on the Jewish side, he's working on the Roman side. So what they've done is separate this guy from his other personas, and they've created a new persona called Joseph of Arimathea. And within Arthurian history, the son, he's not really the son, but this is what they had to say, because you've got this 40-year gap in the record. The son of Joseph of Arimathea was called Josephus. And it actually says in the Vulgate cycle, this is not Josephus Flavius, this is another historian who was equally as good.
Oh, so you can see them trying to build up that character, creating it.
Yeah. We believe you. We believe you.
Yeah.
What we're actually saying is that the son of Joseph of Arimathea is Josephus Flavius. But they would have to say this because there's a 40-year gap in the middle that we've got to make up somehow. And the way they made up the gap was by making him the son of himself. And that sorts out the 40-year gap. But again, within Arthurian history, within at least two of the major Arthurian histories, this is High History, who we don't know who wrote High History effectively, and within the Vulgate cycle. The author, this is the 12th century, so these manuscripts written in the 12th century and the early 13th century. And whoever wrote them in the 12th and 13th centuries said that the original author of this book, from which I copied, the manuscript, was Josephus. Now you've got to work out which Joseph.
Which Joseph are you talking about? Yeah, exactly.
Which Josephus are you talking about? So now you have this very influential guy, Saul Josephus, and he was in control of everything after the Jewish revolt, of course. And what he appears to have done is he wrote the secular history of Judea, his Jewish war. He completely changed Orthodox Judaism, stopping the animal sacrifice and everything else. And he may have been instrumental in writing the Talmud as well. He created a new Rome-friendly religion, simple Judaism, which we call Christianity, and therefore influenced all of the Gospels as well, plus writing all of the epistles, of course, Saul's epistles. And now he appears to have written Arthurian history as well. So, as we said at the beginning of this talk, Arthurian history is an amalgamation of two histories. It's a conflation of two histories. It is part British history from Constantine III, etc. But also the other half of it is all about first century Judea and the life of Josephus of Arimathea. Now, all of that second part of Arthurian history was all written by Saul Josephus. So, effectively, we have the most influential person there has been in the last, 4,000 years,
right,
who has influenced, Western history and Western culture and Western society more than anybody else there has ever been. Because, you imagine, much of our society is Judaic, and yet he effectively changed Judaism. Our society is Christian, so all of the Christian story, he was behind that as well. And then all of the mythology, so if you're not part of the Christian scene, then you're probably following the mythological scene. All of that mythological scene has been influenced by the Arthurian story, and yet he wrote that as well. There's not very much that he didn't influence, really. Oh, and he wrote all of the secular history of first century Judea as well, so he influenced the secular history as well. If you look at any normal history of Rome and the East, it's all based on the work of Saul Josephus. So one can say that this guy was the most influential person there's ever been in the last 2,000 years, bar none.
And he's working for Rome, right?
So he's working for Rome.
So he's a good writer. Do you think I don't know, do you get the sense of him being particularly passionate about what he's doing? Is he's not doing this with a gun to his head, clearly. He's doing this because he's a good writer, and they hired him for a reason, right? Well, they
hired him for a reason, is because he would say yes to anyone. So the most important thing in the life of Saul Josephus, the most important person, was himself. He was the biggest egotist and narcissist ever in the history of man. So the only thing that mattered was Saul Josephus. And so he would say anything and do anything to further his own position in his own career. So I don't think he necessarily had a great story to tell. He didn't have, some fundamental morality or ethos or something he was trying to impart on to society and to mankind. He was just doing it for himself.
Right. There might have been others that were helping him to craft this, that were clearly steering the writing in a particular direction. He's just a guy trying to get his way up the top, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I found this out again via Arthurian history, which is why looking into Arthurian history is so important. That some of the things that were created within Christianity do not exactly seem like things that Saul Josephus would be writing and doing. And I did wonder for a long time why these elements were within the Christian church. And it plainly states within History of the Holy Grail, which is one of the books of the Vulgate cycle. And Vespasian, this is Emperor Vespasian, sends Joseph of Arimathea to Sarras. And Sarras is quite obviously Edessa, basically. This is after the Jewish revolt. So Joseph of Arimathea, this is what I say about Joseph of Arimathea. This is the great guy who took Jesus down from the cross. He is working for Vespasian. He is the spokesperson for Emperor Vespasian after the Jewish revolt. And you've got to wonder why that is, So Vespasian sends him to Sarras with 72 disciples or apostles to change the religion of Sarras, which is basically Edessa. And Josephus is not very keen on this because this is enemy territory, basically. Rome had just been fighting these guys. So he was going into enemy territory on behalf of Rome with 70 evangelists. And God says, and you can obviously see that this is Vespasian speaking. Vespasian says to Josephus of Arimathea, "Go there and open your mouth, and I will put the words into your mouth that you need to say."
Like a teleprompter or something. We'll have a...
Now we have it in black and white. Now we know who's talking.
Right.
So a lot of what he was actually saying and what actually became Christianity was not actually written by Josephus himself. He was there just to open his mouth, and Vespasian would put the words into his mouth. And that clears up the problem with all of the elements within Christianity that don't suit what Saul Josephus would have actually done himself. And they don't even suit the epistles. You know, you've got these epistles, these are letters written by Saul, and they don't mention any of this, which is absolutely crazy. You know, these letters were written after the crucifixion, supposedly, and yet they don't mention any of the Last Supper. They don't mention any of the crucifixion. They don't mention the tomb and the resurrection. Why? You know, these letters were supposed to be written by a great follower of Jesus in the AD 50s. So why doesn't he mention any of these points?
Yeah.
You know, there's a couple of little verses that just say crucifixion in them. But that's not the crucifixion story. There's no trial of Jesus. There's no scourging of Jesus. There's no walking through Jerusalem with the cross. There's no being crucified. There's no people at the bottom of the cross. There's no spear. There's no sponge. There's no being taken down from the cross. There is no tomb. There is no open tomb. There is no body gone missing. None of that story is in the letters written by Saul when he was evangelizing across the Mediterranean in the AD 50s. Why not? There's this enormous great hole within Christianity that no one will talk about, that Saul never mentioned any of this in the AD 50s. Why? Because it hadn't happened yet.
Right.
And yet this is not mentioned by any standard theologian. And yet it's a huge, great hole within the Christian story that Saul does not mention the main topic, the main item within Christianity. And he does not mention it at all. And so when we're looking at these stories, we need an explanation that will explain all of these elements, all of these difficult elements that people will not talk about. And my new version of the gospel story explains all of those points. So just the mere fact of saying that Saul is Josephus explains all of these points. Josephus could not have been writing about the crucifixion event on his evangelical tours in AD 52 and AD 55 when he went across the Mediterranean, because the crucifixion had not happened yet. And so the explanation I've put together explains all of those items, all of those difficulties about the Christian story. It explains who Saul was. It explains the events of the gospel story. it explains everything that you can possibly ask about the gospel story, and places all of these people back into the historical record, so they are real historical characters. So Saul becomes Josephus, who was obviously a prince of Edessa. That's why he was based in Antioch, Edessa, as it says in Acts of the Apostles. And Jesus was a prince of Edessa. And the prince in the AD 70s, so we're talking about an AD 70 story now, of course, with the Jewish revolt. The prince who started the Jewish revolt was called King Esus Manu of Edessa. And that is why that Jesus has this strange name, which again nobody wants to talk about because they don't know what it means. He was called Jesus Emmanuel. Why did they have this prophecy that he would be called Emmanuel when he is never called Emmanuel? So this new history that I've created, these new revisions to the established story, explain all of the difficulties we have with the normal Christian story. So standard Christian history, you'll get from any theologian or from any priest, will not be able to explain so many items about the story if you want to ask them, the difficult questions like who are Saul, who is Jesus, when did this happen, why can't we see this in the historical record? But this new explanation explains all of those missing points completely. It can explain who Jesus was, who Saul was, when this happened. It explains why Saul's story cannot mention the crucifixion, because it hadn't actually happened yet. It didn't happen until AD 70. And it also explains exactly who Jesus was and why he had that prophecy that said he would, a prince would be born and his name would be Emmanuel. The entire gospel story is really based upon this prophecy because Jesus only became the Messiah, the Christ, the King, because he was called Emmanuel. That's what the prophecy said. And yet he was never called Emmanuel. So why did Jesus have this name that he was never actually called and never used? And the reason is it came out of history again. It came from this same explanation we've had before about Jesus being a prince of Edessa. The king we were talking about before from Edessa was King Agbarus, but he died in about AD 50s, something like that. And it was his son who prosecuted the Jewish revolt in AD 68 to AD 70. And his name was Esus Manu. And this is why we have this story in the Gospels about Jesus being called Emmanuel. This was his second hidden name. So in the Gospels, the name of Jesus was Jesus Emmanuel, while in Edessan history, the name of this prince was King Esus Manu. And he was the leader of the Jewish revolt, which we've seen before. But interestingly, when I went to Edessa and I started looking at some of the coinage of Edessa, it was also clear that the ceremonial crown of the Edessan monarchy was a crown of thorns. So here we have a monarch from Edessa who was involved in a revolt in Judea and effectively was the king of Judea as well, because this family owned the largest palace in Jerusalem, for instance. So effectively they were the kings of Judea as well. And he was crucified after the Jewish revolt, and he was wearing the standard Edessan crown, which was a crown of thorns. It is the same story. And so what we have here is a comprehensive story that tells us everything about how the gospel story was created. And it's the same story, in effect. There is nothing really within the gospel story that I've seen that did not happen within the historical record. So the gospel story changes somewhat. It's no longer mythology. This all actually happened pretty much as it says within the Gospels. The only problem for a committed Christian is the story changes somewhat. So Jesus becomes a prince, he becomes a king. This is an AD 70s story, and it is a story about power politics within Judea and within Rome, rather than being a pure spiritual story. And the hidden story that they didn't want you to know within the gospel story was that this was not a battle for Judea. So we've been talking about the Jewish revolt here, but the Jewish revolt was not a revolt about Judea. This was about the Edessan monarchy trying to take over the Roman Empire. So this was a battle actually for the throne of Rome, not for the throne of Judea. And this is why Rome was obviously so much against this particular revolution, because obviously they didn't want these Eastern monarchs to take over the Roman Empire. And significantly, the person who won this particular battle, who won the Jewish revolt and defeated King Esus of Edessa, was Vespasian. He was the commander in charge of the battle in Judea. And it was Vespasian who went on to become the next emperor of Rome. So this really was a battle for the throne of Rome. There were more than two contenders. There were actually 4 or 5 contenders, because this was the year of 4 emperors. Nero died in 68. And then we have complete turmoil in the Roman Empire when 3 emperors come and go within 1 year. And then we end up with this final battle between 2 characters. And the final battle is Vespasian against King Esus of Edessa. So this was not a battle for Judea. This was the final act within the year of 4 emperors, or 5 emperors actually, as it happens.
I see, yeah.
The final battle was between Vespasian and Esus, and it was Vespasian who won. And it was Vespasian who became the next emperor of Rome. So yeah, this was a battle for the throne of Rome. This is what this was all about. This was the big story.
So how was the mythological element woven in? Because so we've got essentially, like you saying, that you can look at what's being said in the Gospels, and a lot of that happened. But then there are those elements that get brought in, some of the details, like we were referencing the 12 disciples, and then of course with Arthur you have the 12 knights of the Round Table. You have these references, and we know that Rome was also very much steeped in religions like Mithraism and other religions that were very much related to astrological and mythological aspects, right? So was this part of this recrafting of the story, was to say, okay, we're going to take the history, we're going to change the timeline, we're going to still have the historical facts embedded in it, but in order to cover the tracks of the fact that we literally transported this into a different time, we're going to weave in the mythology of the day. We're going to weave in these other aspects of it to try to, I guess, camouflage it, or maybe in some way, some people interpret it as bringing in another depth to the story, which is what makes them spiritual scripture or whatever. I don't know. What's your take on how that really all kind of comes together?
Well, these astrological aspects were actually the key part of the original religion. So, in a way, they've been sidelined and airbrushed out of this religion by the new religion that was created by Saul and by Vespasian. So, the central topic of this religion, this is the Nazarene, not the Jewish religion as such, this is the Nazarene religion. The central component within this religion was the processional zodiac, which is why when you go to, most of the old synagogues from the 1st to the 5th century in Judea, they all have a zodiac on the floor. And the best of these zodiacs, I think, is the one at Hamat Tavera, which is a processional zodiac. And so this is a Jewish zodiac. It has, the menorah, it has the Ark of the Covenant, it has the three plants that are part of Judaism, and it has a zodiac. And the central component in the zodiac is actually Helios, the sun. So here you have a Judaic zodiac from the 1st century in Galilee, and this was the central component of that religion at that time. And for whatever reason, that has been airbrushed out of Christianity. And I think one of the reasons is that Saul Josephus was never initiated into the secrets of the processional zodiac, because they didn't trust this guy. I mean, even from the New Testament accounts, you can see that Saul was persecuting the Christians, they say. He was persecuting the Nazarene Christians and committing them to prison. And actually, that's something else, because they never mentioned how that happened. What gave Saul the authority to go and arrest Nazarene Christians in Judea and Syria and commit them to prison? Well, because he was Saul Josephus Flavius, and he was the army commander in command of Galilee. That's how he had the power and the authority to commit these people to prison. So anyway, the end result is they didn't trust this guy, because he was working for the opposition. Even, way back in the 60s, he was probably working for the opposition. And so he was never initiated into the secrets of the processional zodiac, so he didn't understand it. And if Saul Josephus didn't understand it, then no one else was going to know about it either, because the last thing that Saul Josephus would want you to know is that he was ignorant. He didn't know anything. And so the easiest way to get rid of that problem is to just delete it completely, which is why you see very little of this within Christianity. There is a little astrological sort of hints at within Christianity, but not very much. But it was originally the central part of this religion. And funnily enough, this particular zodiac on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, there is a curious little part of Josephus' Jewish war, his account of the Jewish war, where he is actually sent by the Judean authorities to go and destroy this very zodiac, which is a very nice little part of history. I love these parts of history where you can actually read about something that happened in history, and then you can actually go to the same artifact and actually go and see it.
Right, yeah.
So yeah, he was the army commander in charge of Galilee, and he was told by the Judean authorities to go and destroy this palace that had that had images of animals on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, 4 furlongs south of Tiberias. And of course, if you go to Tiberias now and you go 4 furlongs south of the old city wall, you will come to Heretical. You'll come to this very same zodiac. So Josephus himself was sent to destroy this particular zodiac, which sort of tells us that, again, he didn't know what this zodiac was about. If he was prepared to go and just, do his job and go and destroy it, he was obviously not a part of the system that was venerating this particular zodiac. So he didn't understand it. And so, as I said, if he couldn't understand it, then it wasn't going to be a central part of his religion. And he created this new religion. So that is why all of this particular history has been destroyed. And so the people who did understand it, remember, they weren't all destroyed. So after the Jewish revolt, Saul Josephus won, of course, this particular revolt. But of course, there were elements of Nazarene Judaism that survived. And within subsequent history, these are called the Nazarene Christians. And they were a part of the flight to Pella, they call it, when the Nazarene Christians went to Pella, which is just across the River Jordan in modern-day Jordan. There's an old Roman city there called Pella. And this is where they went to. And this was the seat of the next Jewish revolt, which was the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century, was centered on Pella. Why? Because that's where the Nazarene Christians, the Nazarene Jews, went to after the first Jewish revolt. So this belief system didn't die out completely just because they lost the Jewish revolt. There were still many people who understood the processional zodiac. There were still many people in Egypt who understood the processional zodiac. Because if you look at the zodiac at Dendera, the very famous zodiac you see from Egypt, that is a processional zodiac as well. It's the same as the zodiac at Heretical. And if you go to Stonehenge as well, I'm writing about this as well. It's a part of the Arthurian history. Stonehenge is also a processional zodiac.
Right, yeah.
If you go to look at it. And of course, Stonehenge was the burial place for Uther Pendragon, the father of King Arthur, of course, was supposed to be buried at Stonehenge. And Stonehenge is a processional zodiac. It's exactly the same as Heretical. So this religion, this cosmic astrological religion, was quite widespread at the time. So it was never going to be killed off by one action happening in Judea.
It would have been, I guess it would have been really the oldest religion. If you think back, yeah. It would have been, the first thing they would have looked at would have been the stars, and then they would have started the process. You go back to Egypt and all these cultures. And then, so you're saying that originally it may have been fully intact in that way, and then as it started migrating and moving and these different empires were formed, and then all of these different things started branching off, you'll still see the remnants of that original story, but then it gets a little bit of history involved with this sort of manipulation here and there, and now we've got all these different bits and pieces, so it's really just a shattered mess at this point.
It is. It's a shadow of its former self, because a lot of the priesthood were decimated in various different eras by different people. The Druids were wiped out by the Romans. And if anyone held the secrets of Stonehenge and Avebury, it was going to be the Druids. And so that arm of this religion was killed off by the Romans. the Romans again killed off Nazarene Judaism within Judea. And so all of the information about the Hamat-Tavera zodiac and the knowledge from there would have been effectively destroyed by the Romans at that point. But then in Egypt, and again back in Judea later on, it was also decimated by the Christians, of course, because the Christians destroyed the library at Alexandria. And so if there were any secrets that were still being held within Egypt at that time, they would have been destroyed by the Christians.
That's right, yeah.
And likewise in Judea again, because that became Christian. And again, it was the Christians who wiped out the Nazarene Christians, who weren't Christians at all. They were Nazarene. They were the Church of Jesus and James. It was the Christians who wiped out them as well. It was the Christians who wiped out the Arians after the first council in the early 4th century, the one that was held by Constantine I. And that wiped out a lot of the considered to be heretical Christian sects, so all of the Gnostic sects of Christianity, all of the Arians, were all wiped out at that stage because they became heretical. They weren't part of the new Catholic, which means global Christian church. So really from that time onwards, so we're really talking from the 1st century onwards, this old astrological religion was being systematically wiped out by various authorities and various other religions. And so, yeah, not very much of it survived. And I'm often left wondering how much of it did survive.
Yeah, good question. Why do I think that Jesus was a king of Edessa? Well, that's a long story. It goes back to the first book in this series, in the King Jesus trilogy, which was called Cleopatra to Christ. And as the title suggests, I suggest that Jesus was from the family of Queen Cleopatra, the famous Queen of Egypt. How so? Well, because in 43 BC, Cleopatra was in Rome, the guest of Julius Caesar, of course. And Julius Caesar was killed, obviously. He was murdered in 43 BC on the Ides of March. And Queen Cleopatra flees for Egypt. And Cicero says something strange. He says that he wishes that Cleopatra has the same problem as Tertia, who had just had a miscarriage. And it's quite obvious that Cicero is implying that Cleopatra was pregnant when she left for Egypt. And he is afraid of the scion of Caesar, the heir of Caesar. So he thinks that Cleopatra might have a son. But we hear no more about this son. Why? Well, either Cleopatra had a miscarriage, as Cicero wanted, or this was a daughter instead, which would have been no good to Cleopatra at all. And so we hear nothing more about this child until we come to about 20 BC. And the new emperor of Rome is Augustus Caesar, and he's sorting out the boundaries of the Roman Empire. And to Juba II in North Africa, in Mauritania, who's his old mate, childhood mate, they were brought up in the same household, he gives Juba II Cleopatra Selene as a wife. And Cleopatra Selene was the daughter of Queen Cleopatra. And then he goes to the east, to Parthia, who was the big enemy of Rome. And he sees the king there, who's Phraates IV, and he gives him some diplomatic presents. And one of the presents he gives him is a concubine called Thermusa. And this just does not ring true because, the emperor cannot be giving a princess to Juba II, and then, who's only a minor prince, of course, and then giving the major king of Parthia a concubine. So how do we sort out this little problem? Well, it seems fairly obvious that Queen Thermusa, as she is better known, Thermusa Aurania, was actually the lost daughter, the forgotten daughter of Queen Cleopatra. It's the only way we can make sense of this scenario. And so the daughter of Cleopatra is given to Phraates IV as a diplomatic bride. And he was so impressed with this supposed concubine that Phraates IV made Thermusa, Queen Thermusa, his chief wife. And it is from Thermusa that the next king of Parthia was born. So it was quite obvious that she had to be very important. And she was. She was the forgotten daughter of Queen Cleopatra. And Julius Caesar, of course. So, the next queen of Parthia is this daughter of Cleopatra. Until, of course, about 2 BC, when there is a conspiracy in the royal court of Parthia, and the king is murdered. And Queen Thermusa takes control of the country with her son, who's probably in his teens at that time, who's called Phraates V, and sometimes he's called Phraates's. And they become the king and queen of Parthia. But the Parthians obviously weren't very impressed with the way this had happened. And the king and queen get thrown out of the country. So here we have the beginnings of the biblical story. So what is the biblical story? The biblical story is about a royal family. Because Jesus was a king, he was called a king both at his birth and his crucifixion. He was called the King of the Jews. So we have a royal family who are impoverished for some reason. They're in a stable, apparently, with a royal birth in somewhere in Syria, Judea, who were visited by the Magi. And the Magi are the priests and the kingmakers of Parthia. So why would the priests of Parthia be interested in the birth of a Jewish prince, a king of Judea? Well, ordinarily they wouldn't, of course, but in this new scenario, of course, they would, because here in the story of the Queen of Parthia, we have the same scenario. So Queen Thermusa and her son were exiled from Parthia in AD 4. So we have a royal family from the east travelling to Syria, Judea, in a state of some poverty, and maybe having a royal birth at this stage. And this is a royal birth that the Magi of Parthia would have been interested in, of course, because this was the king and queen, or the ex-king and queen, of Parthia. So here we have the biblical narrative of a royal family in a position of poverty who were visited by the Magi. And this is why I say that this is the foundation of the biblical story. But we can take this one stage further, because we then have a story in Josephus Flavius's accounts of Syria and Judea, which says that out of the east, this royal family arrived, and they are called the kings and queens of Adiabeni, which is supposed to be a place over in Iraq near Mosul, called Arbela. But there is no trace of this family whatsoever over in Arbela. They just simply don't exist. There is no archaeology for it whatsoever. There's just a few notes in the works of Josephus. But the interesting thing is, if we go to the Syriac historians, and this is where having the two stories is very important. We have the Josephus story, the Roman story, but we also have the Syriac and Armenian story from the historians from that region as well. And they say that the Queen of Adiabene was actually Queen Helena of Edessa. So now we can move this story over a little bit. It wasn't a story from Arbela, near Mosul. It was the story of the royal family of Edessa, the famous family, or they should have been very famous, family from 1st century Syria, northern Syria, in Edessa. And from this combination of these two accounts, from the Roman accounts and from the Syriac accounts, we know that the kings and princes of Edessa started the Jewish revolt. Well, first of all, they became proselyte Jews. They converted to Judaism, and we have that both from Josephus and from the Talmud, who tells us that they converted to Judaism. So yes, they were Jews, proselyte, converted Jews. And they started the Jewish revolt. And it was this same king of Edessa who, after the Jewish revolt, was crucified along with two other leaders in the Jewish revolt, and then taken down from the cross by Josephus Flavius. Josephus Flavius of Arimathea, of course. So now we've sort of come full circle again, because from this story about this exiled Egypto-Parthian monarchy, we now have the story of the birth of Jesus and also the crucifixion of Jesus from this very same family, from the family of Edessa. And of course, when this king was crucified, this king of Edessa, he would most probably have been wearing the Edessan royal regalia. And it just so happens that the crown of Edessa is a crown of thorns. So here we have a king of Edessa who's being crucified in the 1st century, who would have been wearing a crown of thorns. It is the same story. So this was the basis of the King Jesus trilogy, and the third book in that trilogy, of course, was Jesus, King of Edessa, because he was a king of Edessa. And so, yes, we know that Jesus was a king, and it was this role as the king of Judea, the king of Edessa, who was trying to take over Judea, but also trying to take over the throne of Rome at the same time. It is this story that became amalgamated into some of the Arthurian history as well. So this makes Arthurian history quite valuable in a way, because it fills in some of the gaps and some of the holes in the story that we have at present. We have the story from Josephus Flavius. We have a little bit of the story from the Syriac historians. We have an amount of history from the Gospels, although it's a little bit garbled, but nevertheless it's there. But there are various holes in that story, and Arthurian history picks up on that. and fills in a few of those gaps, which is why it's so important. So that's why the next book in this trilogy, so it's now become a trilogy in 4 parts basically, is able to fill in a lot of the Arthurian history, but it's also able to fill in a lot of the biblical type history as well. And I find this interesting in a way because it means that historically a lot of the New Testament material is actually correct. At present, if you look at the New Testament stories from the Orthodox viewpoint, from the Christian viewpoint, none of it exists in the historical record. It's almost like a complete fantasy. You have to believe it in faith. That's why the church promotes faith, of course, because there is no evidence. These people do not exist. But if you look at it from this point of view, from the Parthian history point of view, from the Edessan point of view, suddenly a lot of this becomes real history. Okay, it's a little bit different to what a Christian would normally expect. So, Jesus is a king, a real king, not just a pretend king. And his goals were slightly more secular than the New Testament would like us to think. So he was a real king looking for a real throne to sit upon, and possibly even the throne of Rome, come to that. So this was a real battle for power within the Roman Empire, not just a spiritual battle. But that aside, it has the benefit of making pretty much most of the gospel stories real history. We can find these people in the historical record and we know who they are. And if you don't mind changing the biblical story or the foundations of the biblical story a little bit, it means that we now know who these people are. It's part of real history. So yes, Jesus was a king of Edessa. So it's quite a change, I suppose, for theologians to take on board. But it's interesting nevertheless. Yes, so if listeners want to have some more information on these books, this is mainly taken from the King Jesus trilogy, which is originally came in 3 books, obviously, but now it's almost in 5 books in a way. So we start with Cleopatra to Christ, King Jesus, and then Jesus, King of Edessa. Shortly to be released will be the Grail cipher, and then tacked on to the end of that as an afterthought, I suppose, there is also the book Mary Magdalene, Princess of Orange, which again takes on the post-crucifixion story of Mary Magdalene and traces her emigration to southern France. So that's an interesting story as well. All details of these books are on Edfu Books, that's edfu-books.com. There's a Facebook site as well, which is the Gospel of King Jesus website. And there's a few discussions going on there. All of the books are on Amazon, of course, as paperbacks and as Kindle books as well. But if you're looking for paperbacks, it's probably best to try and pick up the 2014 or 2015 editions because they have been updated. And otherwise, the books, if you're in America, are available from Adventures Unlimited. And David Childress there does a very good job of all of these esoteric books, so I well recommend going onto his website. That's Adventures Unlimited of Kempton in Illinois. So yes, I hope readers enjoy various books. I think there's about 10 in the series now, if you include the Old Testament ones as well. And I hope we come back and do another interview shortly. Thank you.